Excelentísimo señor presidente.
President of the 72nd session of the General Assembly of the United Nations, Mr. Miroslav Lajcak, Excellencies, Head of State and Government, distinguished delegates, and dear friends. Mr. President, Costa Rica congratulates you for your appointment and welcomes the priorities that you have established under your leadership. I would like to reiterate my country's commitment to work with you, along with the other member states, in order to set the 2030 agenda for sustainable development and to enforce without delay the Paris and Marrakesh commitments, to implement the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to strengthen world governance and multilateralism as spaces to preserve international peace and stability. Mr. President, I'd also like to extend a message of solidarity and affection for the people and government of Mexico for the human and material losses which they have experienced in the earthquake that affected their capital and surrounding areas today. Each word, declaration, and action adopted in these premises keeps alive Kant's hope and inspiring faith in humanity. Building a world from the 2030 agenda, the Paris Agreement, Beijing +20, treaties on the non-proliferation of weapons, and treaties on the prohibition and disarmament of nuclear weapons, reveals that we are aware of the multiple challenges that we human communities face. And we recall our firm belief in cooperative responses to the most pressing issues of humanity. At the same time, these recent milestones are inspired by the enlightened understanding of those who, before us and under critical conditions, stood up for a decent coexistence, defended freedom as a mandate for life, and kept alive hope as a daily imperative. As world leaders, we are charged with directing our people towards sustainable development. The ethical power of our actions should not be limited to our domestic policies, but rather must transcend this assembly, where active engagement can generate well-being and tackle inequality, injustice, and violence, even if this implies generating inconvenience to those who don't want the world to be an open, unbiased, and inspiring hearth for us all. Thus, this aspiration sometimes experiences resistance and misconceptions. Before these walls of short-sightedness and evil, Costa Rica has always chosen honest work. Our lack of stature has not limited our restless capacity to give generously to others. As the main values for the full observance of human rights, my country has chosen compassion, solidarity, and peace building. Our values have converted international law, active multilateralism, and the rejection of environmental predation into the ideal mechanisms for conflict resolution both inside and among world states. This is essentially our commitment to humankind. In September 2016, Costa Rica became the first country to establish a national agreement to meet the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. We included a special provision to include, along the process, the heads of the supreme powers of the Republic, local government representatives, the business sector, religious groups, social organizations, and academia. And they have all actively engaged their agendas in the implementation of the SDGs. This initiative aligned the National Development Plan 2015-2018 with both the SDGs and targets for national and local programs and projects. And through consensus building dialogue and accountability, the National Development Plan established the functional strategy for SDG planning, implementation, and follow-up. 2 years ago, at this assembly, I stated that Costa Rica was committed to the design and implementation of the appropriate tools to wage a real and sustainable campaign against poverty. Given the multidimensional nature of poverty, we implemented the Multidimensional Poverty Index along with a functional and multi-actor governance structure. This became one of the most important breakthroughs. We reduced poverty in Costa Rica for the first time in the last 7 years. This was achieved through an articulated and coordinated decision-making process, a design of initiatives, and implementation of a domestic strategy. On the occasion of the UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, Costa Rica and another 42 countries submitted to a national voluntary report on the implementation of the SDG goals. In this sense, Costa Rica, along with the other member countries of the Central American Integration System, sponsored the harmonization of the regional agenda with these goals. Costa Rica is aware of the integral, universal, and multidimensional nature of the SDGs. Therefore, we believe that their implementation requires political innovation. Leaving no one behind is a state and government responsibility, but these entities should not act alone. And this is why the 2030 agenda should be based on consensus, generating synergy, creative participation, and on the commitment of multiple stakeholders, as well as productive sectors. It should be based above all on this Assembly's commitment and call to action, since leaving no one behind is more than a motto. It is a compelling call to action for all sectors in society. I emphasize, therefore, the content and the quality of the Secretary General's report on the repositioning of the UN development system to honor the ambitious 2030 agenda objectives. I consider this to be the appropriate path to coordinate and to undertake global actions that will respond to current and future specific sustainable development needs. Within this framework, we have to think about the needs of middle-income countries. I find it appropriate to continue working on these efforts and on the interests of these countries, so that the United Nations system can offer an efficient, focused, and best coordinated support. In this regard, Costa Rica would like to emphasize the importance for other countries as well as for the UN system, the importance of rethinking the concept of per capita income as a benchmark for determining a country's development. Only a multidimensional vision of development, especially a multidimensional view of poverty, will allow us to understand the needs of populations, families, and their members in terms of access to healthcare, social equality, gender equality, and to address social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities, among other challenges of developing countries. And with all due respect, but with urgency, I request the Secretary General to promote spaces that will implement working strategies to strengthen the capabilities of these countries and will allow more efficiency when cooperating with middle-income and least developed countries. For these countries, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals will be impossible unless the economic, social, and environmental problems are incorporated in the global roadmaps. As a universal forum, the UN system is in a privileged position to consolidate a cooperative strategy with middle-income countries. With undeniable authority, Amartya Sen has stated that in order to talk about development of any society, we have to analyze the life of its members. And economic success is not possible without taking the quality of life of the communities into account. And that is the quality of life of each of its members. In this regard, minority groups that have been historically excluded from the full realization of their rights and those societies hosting them must be given special regard to meet the 2030 agenda. We must be especially attentive of productive sectors such as family farming, for example. Family farming is the main source of income for 70% of the poor rural population of the world, and that is 40% of the world's population. Around 500 million small farms provide 80% of the food consumed by developing countries, becoming in many cases the historical basis of the productive development of entire nations. And this is the case for my country, for example. Family farming is essential to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, since it encompasses, in a comprehensive way, the Sustainable Development Goals. It is the basis of sustainable food production. It is essential for environmental management of rural and maritime territories where it is developed. And to biodiversity, it is also the source of remarkable cultural manifestations of communities. And in the final analysis, is the cornerstone of a country's comprehensive development. From this perspective, Costa Rica, along with countries from different parts of the world, Costa Rica will have the honor to present during this session a resolution stating the Decade of Family Farming 2019 to 2028, inspired by the success of the International Year of Family Farming, approved by the General Assembly in 2014. Mr. President, gender equality remains an objective of the greatest importance for all of our countries. Every day, women strive for a world where the full recognition and exercise of their rights is more tangible. Their fights are inherent to the building of truly democratic societies and the inclusive coexistence in all of our countries. Furthermore, the fight to achieve full women's rights is an exercise that needs to be fully implemented to make the SDGs a reality within the time that is expected by this organization. There is a great deal of literature, and as well as many political declarations, which stress the democratic deficit and prejudices in terms of development derived from the persistent patriarchal structures which are forged in former times, but remain perpetuated today because of a lack of education on rights and respect for democratic coexistence. Gender inequality is not an alien topic that manifests itself in a hidden way within the inner relations of countries beyond our sight. Inequality is everywhere. It's right in front of our eyes. Take a moment to look around. It's imperative to take specific action and to make sure that more women are our peers in this important chamber. My country has understood this commitment and embraces the proposals of the International Gender Champions, which aim to reverse gender inequality within the UN and to take specific actions in the 72nd session to call upon those gender champions in order to promote gender balance within the delegations attending the general debate during the high-level week of the General Assembly. Women's effective participation in the economic sectors of their societies has a deep and significant impact in other areas of independence, because a woman economically empowered is a person with the tools and capabilities necessary to make a positive impact in her community. While it's true that many women are entrepreneurs, many work in the public and private sectors, millions work in the informal sector, and others do domestic work and unpaid care. It is estimated that the unpaid work of women is equivalent to 10 million US dollars a year, or 13% of the global GDP. However, if I were to choose a singular, insulting, and absurd example of this discrimination, the one that causes me the most indignation is that the average woman's salary is 25% lower than the average man's salary for the same job. I had the honor to co-chair the high-level panel on women's economic empowerment, along with Mrs. Simona Scarpoleggio, CEO of IKEA Switzerland, at the request of the former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and UN Women. The final report, in which women worldwide participated, the final report concluded that, and I quote, "It's essential to expand social protection coverage and access to justice with due process." Care is also an economic activity whose contribution should be reflected in the country's productivity. Men should have a shared responsibility of fulfilling this labor, and private companies as well as public institutions must facilitate it. Women have the challenge of accessing digital and financial services, as well as owning land. It's necessary that enterprises recognize women's leadership. It's urgent that macroeconomic policies of states empower women and promote decent jobs. Laws causing and perpetuating discrimination must be amended, and those encouraging equality must be enacted. Affirmative policies on hiring women must be extended to public institutions and private companies, and women-owned businesses must be promoted. It's necessary as well to strengthen support to informal workers and agricultural workers. Of course, we need to adopt a multidimensional and intersectoral strategy to address the barriers to women's economic empowerment. In this sense, Costa Rica has a public policy that guarantees women's employability on an equal basis. As its main objective, this is a policy which aims to eliminate the access and permanence gap, whose main actor is the private sector as the main source of employment and national development. This practice is part of the new trend in international markets and the global economy, where companies seek to increase their productivity through innovation, through improvement of the work environment, attracting talent, and the adoption of values and practices based on a human rights approach. Nonetheless, we recognize that multiple challenges remain towards substantive equality for women. Our determination is to achieve women's incorporation in paid work with measures that eradicate division based on gender in the workplace, and to facilitate the economic autonomy and the high quality of life as necessary conditions for the full enjoyment of human rights. And with your permission, today, for 1 minute, I would like to send this message in English to all of the women who, with their work, ennoble their families, and local communities.
I extend my recognition to all women on earth. You are capable enough to move ahead despite the rigid and rude patriarchal heritage that tends to not acknowledge your abilities and accomplishments. And that fills with doubts and dangers your road towards your full autonomy. You are an example for others. Your internal strength leads you to break the chains of oppression, rise above tearing migrations and forced displacement, free entire communities from unexpected forms of slavery. And within this grim march that your life is, you devote with deep passion to your people, with whom you are sensible and protective even when your love and generosity are not understood nor repaid. You are masters of resilience, since you have learned how to deal with the wrong people and painful moments. You know how to fulfill your roles of mother, partner, friend, or leader, and you dedicate to them, even you need to sacrifice yourself because of a superior responsibility, a greater good that you accomplish with sincere devotion, aware of the risks and bearing in mind that you are an example to other women that follow your steps. Definitely, it is not easy being a Khaleesi. Whether in fiction or in real life, the goal of equality is much greater than what we are circumstantially here. Today is a good day to look ourselves in the mirror, start to create truly equal relations, and take this long night to its end. Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, our grandparents could not foresee the consequences that industrialization and business models would have on climate. We, grandparents of future generations, can. That is why we cannot be indifferent. It's true that for many decades, humankind has had the resources and scientific knowledge to measure with precision the behavior of endless variables related to the environment and can design future scenarios for weather conditions in different parts of the world and their impact on humans and their social, productive, and cultural activities. These capabilities commit us at levels seldom achieved throughout the history of humankind. We are endorsed by an ethic responsibility about the future of life on Earth and the interaction between human groups and their environment. There's enough evidence to support the idea that a transformative solution to climate change is within human capabilities, and that's why we welcome the French initiative of the Global Pact for the Environment, which would complement the legal framework of the international agreements adopted by the UN in 1966. We also express our great satisfaction in being a member of the group of friends that, under the leadership of Slovenia, Switzerland, Morocco, the Maldives, and Costa Rica, promotes the resolution on human rights and the environment, which was coordinated within the Human Rights Council. Also, along with countries of the Alliance of Latin America and the Caribbean, ILAC in Spanish, we have exercised a positive leadership in the negotiations of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, building bridges between the negotiating groups and making proposals. Our countries, Mr. President, must adopt increasingly ambitious positions on environmental conservation, as well as in the fight against climate change, understanding them as the unavoidable right of every human being and future generations to live in a healthy and ecologically balanced environment. Mr. President, delegates, Secretary General, you can count on the unconditional and unrestricted support of the Costa Rican people in promoting this vital agenda. With satisfaction, I would like the plenary to know that the shared relationship of Chile and Costa Rica, the shared leadership of Chile and Costa Rica, has caused Latin America to move towards establishing a regional instrument on the rights of access to information, participation, and justice on environmental matters. This initiative seeks to produce more effective agreements in the context of socio-environmental conflicts through an environmental governance scheme in which the state would act as a facilitator in agreement and decision-making spaces with the participation of all interested and affected stakeholders. It includes the principle of precaution, reparation, and non-regression. We reaffirm the aspiration of directing our economy towards carbon neutrality as part of pre-2020 voluntary actions. We also deepen our long-term commitments towards decarbonizing the economy. Our electricity matrix continues to be a global example of planning and as well as the use of renewable energies, thanks to the long periods of energy generation based solely on renewable resources, for instance, water, wind, geothermal, biomass, and sunlight. In addition to the compensation process for our forests, we would add the reduction of emissions in critical sectors such as transport, livestock, and waste. We have defined an absolute emission limit by 2030, equivalent to a decrease in emissions of 25% compared to 2012. This places us in a privileged position to become a green center for management, innovation, and knowledge transfer. We invite our strategic partners to join this effort. It is unclear that we cannot improve the health of our oceans if we do not change when it comes to land production and consumption. And in this sense, we recently issued the national policy for wastewater sanitation that seeks to stop pollution resulting from land-based activities and reverse its cumulative effects. We also issued the National Strategy for Plastics Replacement, which is intended to replace the use of straws, coffee, and plastic containers. In addition, we work to end destructive fishing practices and to coordinate efforts for coastal populations to develop from the use and sustainable management of marine coastal resources. Also, in regards to conservation, we presented the National Wetlands Policy, which seeks the ecological rehabilitation of Costa Rican wetland ecosystems and the promotion of actions for their sustainable and participatory use, as well as the establishment of a planned framework in the long term to achieve the restoration of the national wetland systems and to ensure a responsible use of them that will contribute to the improvement of the quality of life of communities. We believe that all of these efforts not only favor the attention and mitigation of climate change, but also its impact on human rights and public policies that promote gender equality, non-discrimination, and the enjoyment of the rights for Indigenous peoples. That's why we also welcome the process to prepare the Global Compact for regular, safe, and orderly migration and the Global Compact on refugees. And I'd like to recall here the principle of progressivity of human rights, an essential principle which implies the extension of the range of rights granted and from which we cannot step back. But above all, it entails that we are called upon to provide our inhabitants with more and better guarantees that would allow the free and full exercise of each of these rights. The 20th century witnessed some of the greatest and most atrocious conflicts that humankind has experienced. The end of World War II marked an even greater threat, one with the potential, now possible, to destroy us as a species. The nuclear arms race was, for much of the second half of the last century, a constant concern that threatened the continuity of the human family. Costa Rica views with great concern the events that are developing in the Korean Peninsula. The increase in the warmongering rhetoric in that part of the Asian continent implies a serious and real threat to the peace and stability not only of that region, but also of the world. Costa Rica looks with amazement at how, after almost 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, ghosts appeared once again, which we thought were previously banished from our world, and where it's now more necessary than ever to provide people with medicine rather than rifles, more schools than military infrastructure, and more projects to provide clear water than main projects to produce weapons of mass destruction. That is why we strongly and vehemently condemn the nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We will always be supportive of dialogue, active diplomacy, and multilateralism. We call upon the parties involved, as well as the UN Security Council, to take an active role in avoiding an escalation of tension that could lead to dire consequences, and from which there is a risk of no return. We cannot remain silent or stand idly by. We demand that the Security Council act immediately to contain this situation, because that is its responsibility. Mr. President, we view with hope, joy, and pride that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was finally approved in July of this year, a process in which I congratulate the Costa Rican ambassador, Elaine White, who, as president of the conference during the negotiations, led the process with courage and great skill. That effort, together with that of the participating delegations, made a dream come true after more than 7 decades. This treaty is a strong message that most of the UN member states do not support, do not accept, and do not consider nuclear weapons as legitimate, and that the international community clearly states that nuclear weapons are not only immoral, ethically unacceptable, but are henceforth illegal. The adoption of this new norm of international law that absolutely prohibits nuclear weapons is therefore established in all circumstances and provides a solid and legally binding framework for the destruction and total elimination of nuclear weapons in a transparent, irreversible, and verifiable manner within specified timeframes. As an unarmed democracy resting its defense on international law, we are satisfied that in addition to prohibiting the development, production, manufacture, transfer, possession, storage, location, installation, and deployment of nuclear weapons, the treaty explicitly prohibits the threat of its use, thereby also banning so-called doctrines of nuclear deterrence security. Now, many will say that all this effort is meaningless, since none of the nuclear powers had wanted to be a part of it. I say to them, with respect, that they are wrong. The desire of the 122 countries that approved the text of the treaty is the legitimate voice of people who love peace and who defend humanity. Any effort to be on the side of disarmament will never be nonsense. Being on the side of peace will never be a mistake. Costa Rica applauds these 122 countries and all those who will sign the treaty tomorrow, and would urgently call for others to join in so that we can ensure a future for us and for those who will come after us. It's our responsibility to continue to support the creation of peace so that we can build the world that we dream about. Costa Rica is constantly shocked by the terrorist attacks that unfortunately happen everywhere in the world, almost every week of the year. Once again, we want to express our absolute and unequivocal condemnation of terrorism in all of its forms and manifestations, no matter who commits it, wherever it may be, and whatever the purpose may be, as well as the need to bring its perpetrators to justice. The fight against terrorism must be framed in strict observance of international law, including human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law. And I wish to emphasize the crucial role of international law as a legitimate mechanism for settling disputes, which we as states must settle. In this respect, and thinking that unilateral economic sanctions lack efficiency as a way to punish governments, but also can cause damage to the rights of peoples to well-being and development. Thus, once again, I would like to express the opposition of my country to the embargo that the U.S. has imposed against Cuba for 55 years, with high human, economic, and social costs for its population. Sir, 69 years ago, Costa Rica decided to exchange weapons and soldiers for notebooks and teachers. 69 years ago, Costa Rica decided to believe, strengthen, and promote international law as the civilized way to resolve their differences with others. And today, 69 years later, Costa Rica continues to believe this. The original goal of the birth of the United Nations was to avoid the scourge of war for future generations. Since 1945, the world has changed dramatically. The threats against peace, stability, and global security are increasingly diverse and complex. However, there is something that has not changed at all, and that is the intrinsic and natural impulse to strive inexhaustibly to reach the dignified and supreme universal values, which are based on law and the prevalence of strong, just institutions over brute force. That is the essence of the institution, to create and sustain peace and the protection of the welfare of citizens of all of the member states. It's not the opposite. It's a global interest to guarantee the well-being of all of our nations. The Andalusian poet Federico Garcia Lorca said that theater is the poetry that rises up from the book and becomes human. And on becoming so, it speaks and it yells, cries. and anguishes. Today we have the obligation to rise from the words we have spoken and to make them a reality. Today we must bring hope back to the heart of every inhabitant on this planet and ensure that this hope is manifested in a dignified life, which is based on the guarantee of fulfillment of their rights and the entirety of their freedom. Although the struggle for human rights is a long-standing historical enterprise, the planet has never had such high levels of education, peace, and fewer armed conflicts as in our time. This should not become a call to demobilization or complacency, but rather an indication that despite everything, and even when there are regions still dominated by war and structural violence, human society is on the right path, with much gratitude owed to the efforts of this organization. Mr. President, every time a father or a mother has claimed from this rostrum, has called for human rights, for equality between men and women, or for the defense of nature against the irrational forces of human greed or consumerism, he or she has felt responsible for the well-being of their children and the individuals who will inherit the future. And I want them to know also that their parents and before them other Costa Rican fathers and mothers who have stood before the General Assembly did so with a great pride of being representatives of a worthy, hardworking, and brave people who love freedom, who build peace day to day, and who will always defend human rights as the supreme good of our universal family. This should make them feel proud and happy, proud of being part of a historical continuum that, like the waves of the sea, will happen time and time again while the world has hope and aspirations for human progress, and happy in the certainty that our work in favor of justice and peace was not, nor has it ever been, in vain. Mr. President, Excellencies, I hope that the UN will continue to be the preferred space of understanding among the peoples of the world. Not a conflict-free space, which unfortunately is not the natural condition of our species, but a meeting point, an area of agreement to make the aspirations of human progress that require survival a reality. And I also hope that this session can be conducted within an increasingly luminous framework of demilitarization and denuclearization, the only paths that will make this survival possible beyond all efforts to guarantee it. And I also hope that from the bottom of my heart, that all nations of the earth represented here are happy, in peace, and capable of asserting the wise biblical admonition of beating swords into plowshares, which is another way of saying, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Thank you very much.